The Battle of the Somme is one of those horrible events in history that everyone knows about, but almost nobody actually understands just how horrible it was. That's because statistics don't show you the real horrors through the eyes of an individual soldier who was there. And the more you look through the eyes of soldiers that were there, the worse it gets. So, some of what you're going to hear, you won't forget easily. Now, like we always do, let's go to where everything began and move from there. By the spring of 1916, the Western Front had been frozen in place for nearly 17 months. After the War of Movement ended, both sides had dug in along a 470 miles long, continuous line of fortified trenches. In less than 5 months of the opening campaigns, the armies on the Western Front had suffered nearly 2 million casualties, out of which 500,000 soldiers were killed. And to make everything only worse, the front lines would barely shift more than 10 miles in either direction for the next 3 years. No one knew how to break this stalemate caused by modern machine guns and artillery used at such a scale for the first time in history, and soldiers were just staying there and dying. Before the Somme offensive, the British fought no significant battles on their sector of the Western Front, yet still suffered over 100,000 casualties. That is roughly 600 men put out of action every single day due to shelling, sniping, disease, and trench raids. The Somme sector, specifically, was one of the quietest stretches of the entire front. Little fighting had occurred there since 1914, and the troops on both sides had adopted what historians call a live-and-let-live system, meaning that soldiers wouldn't shoot if the other side wasn't shooting, because by that point they had all pretty much figured out how pointless this war was, and they just wanted to make it through alive. But the politicians and military leaders had very different plans, as always. Now, before we get into the battle itself, you need to understand who the British soldiers actually were, and why they were marching straight into horrors that perhaps could have been avoided. When Britain declared war on Germany in 1914, it didn't have anywhere near the massive conscript army that France and Germany had. Britain had a small, well-trained professional force, but tiny in numbers compared to the other major powers. Just 3 days after the declaration of war, Kitchener, who was the Secretary of War, went public and asked for 100,000 volunteers. But what happened next surprised even him. In just 1 month, almost 300,000 men signed up. In September 1914 alone, 460,000 men enlisted. And by the time conscription was introduced in 1916, roughly 2.5 million men had voluntarily joined the British Army. But doesn't that sound a bit suspicious? Why were so many young men choosing to go to what would become the most horrific war in human history? Well, at the time, they genuinely didn't know just how bad it was going to get, and we can't blame them for wanting to support their country. But there's more to it than that. Britain hadn't fought a major European war in a century, and for most people, war still had a somewhat romantic or honorable image to it. The idea of being a real man, going off to fight, coming home as a hero, with girls looking at you differently, bringing back stories of your bravery and victory over the enemy, was pretty much the picture for a lot of guys joining the army. And on top of that, they were being deliberately manipulated. It went so far that groups of women were sent to hand out white feathers, which is a symbol of cowardice, to any man they saw in civilian clothes who looked young and healthy enough to serve. The idea spread rapidly across Britain and became a form of public shaming that was genuinely vicious. Men who were home on medical leave, men who had already been discharged after being wounded, men in reserved occupations doing work essential to the war effort, men who were simply too young, all of them were targeted. There is a documented case of a Victoria Cross recipient, a decorated war hero, being handed a white feather on his way to receive his medal because he was in civilian clothes, and in their opinion, he should be fighting the war instead of staying home like a little coward. The pressure this created in communities was enormous and very real. Add to that the fact that Britain in 1914 had significant unemployment in many industrial areas, and the army was offering regular pay, food, clothing, and shelter. And then there was perhaps the biggest factor of all, one directly responsible for the horrors at the Somme being even worse. When your friends, your neighbors, your family members are all enlisting, you can't exactly be the one who stays home and lets them go without you. So the military leaders, or propaganda artists, call them what you want, came up with the idea of what became known as the PALS battalions. Instead of mixing men from all over the country into random units like it's usually military practice, they would let men who enlisted together choose to serve together. Your battle buddies would be your brothers, your friends, your neighbors. It made enlisting easier, and it sounded great in theory. But as you're going to hear, it would turn out to be one of the most catastrophic mistakes in British military leadership. So, like we said, the stalemate had set in, it was clear that neither side was going anywhere, and the Allied commanders had to figure out what to do about 1916. Joseph Joffre was the French commander-in-chief and the most senior Allied commander on the Western Front, which meant the British, as the junior partner in the alliance, largely had to follow his strategic lead. The French and British leaders met and agreed on a massive combined offensive, something large enough to finally break the deadlock. And the place they chose was the Somme Valley in northern France, but not because it had any particular strategic value, not because there were any critical objectives there that would change the course of the war if captured. The Somme was chosen for one reason and one reason only. It was the point on the map where the British and French armies happened to meet. That was it. The original plan had the French carrying the main weight, with around 40 divisions attacking on a 25-mile front south of the river, with the British providing support to the north. But then on February 21st, 1916, Germany launched its massive attack on France at Verdun, and everything began to fall apart. By the time the Somme offensive was due to begin, the French were being bled out exactly as the Germans had intended, and because of that, their contribution to the Somme began to shrink dramatically. First from 40 divisions down to 22, then to 13, and on the actual first day of the battle, only 5 French divisions attacked south of the river. What had been designed as a primarily French offensive with British support had become a primarily British offensive, with the French barely holding on beside them. Meanwhile, Joffre was strongly urging British commander Douglas Haig to begin the attack sooner than Haig felt ready. Haig wanted mid-August, which would have given more time to train his inexperienced troops, stockpile ammunition, and properly prepare. Joffre told him that if the British waited that long, the French army would already be dead before the battle even began. The start date was pushed forward to July 1st, cutting 6 weeks of preparation time that Haig had argued he desperately needed. Henry Rawlinson, who commanded the British Fourth Army, was the man who would actually run the Somme offensive on the ground day to day. Unlike Haig, who was a cavalry officer dreaming of a massive breakthrough through which his cavalry would charge and deliver a decisive blow, Rawlinson had a more realistic idea, and one that was perhaps actually achievable. He'd seen enough failed offensives by this point to know that a massive breakthrough probably wasn't going to happen, so he preferred what was called the bite and hold approach. Attack one specific section of the enemy line, capture it, dig in, use artillery and machine guns to fight off counterattacks and move up, then repeat. Slow, but far safer and far more grounded in reality. So you had 3 men in charge with 3 different visions of how this should go. And here is what they eventually agreed on, after considerable headache and disagreement. Given the forces he had and the ground in front of him, Rawlinson proposed attacking on a front of about 20,000 yards, limiting objectives to the German first defensive line only. Bite and hold, take the first line, consolidate, then plan the next step. Haig rejected this. He widened the attack front to 25,000 yards and ordered that both the German first and second defensive lines should be captured in a single assault. He also wanted cavalry standing by to exploit a breakthrough. This disagreement had horrible consequences for the artillery, which was the heart of the entire plan. The whole attack was based on the belief that a week-long bombardment would destroy German resistance so completely that the infantry would face minimal opposition when they went over the top. Rawlinson had assembled around 1,400 guns for this bombardment, and over the 7 days starting June 24th, they fired somewhere between 1.5 and 1.7 million shells, which was the largest artillery bombardment in history up to that point. Which sounds like an absolutely overwhelming amount of firepower. But because Haig had widened the front and insisted on targeting 2 defensive lines simultaneously instead of 1, those guns were now spread across a much larger area. When you work out the actual weight of shell fire hitting each yard of German trench, the bombardment was less concentrated than some much smaller British operations earlier in the war. The guns were simply stretched too thin. Additionally, the bombardment had 2 other serious problems. The first was that roughly 30% of those shells simply didn't explode. This happened because of the shell crisis of 1915, when Britain wasn't producing nearly enough ammunition, so production was massively ramped up at speed. Quality control suffered, and hundreds of thousands of faulty shells ended up in the supply chain. The second problem was the type of shells being used. About 2/3 of the shells of the entire bombardment were shrapnel shells. It works by spraying lead balls and shrapnel forward in a cone when it detonates, which is absolutely lethal against troops standing in the open, but almost completely useless for the actual jobs that needed doing here. Shrapnel cannot effectively cut barbed wire. It cannot collapse a deep underground dugout. It has no blast effect. The only shell that could do those things was high explosive. But high explosive rounds were still relatively new in production, and there simply weren't enough of them. Plus, they were mostly smaller caliber, so they didn't have the power they needed to do those things. So, the bombardment was overly spread out, riddled with duds, and firing the wrong type of shell for most of its targets. Now, if all this wasn't enough, the Germans had been sitting in this sector since late 1914, with very little fighting to worry about, and they had used those 18 months very well to prepare. They built defenses designed to survive exactly the kind of bombardment the British were planning. The chalk geology of the Somme was perfect for this because chalk is solid and self-supporting, unlike the waterlogged clay in other parts of the front. So the Germans dug deep and firm. Some dugouts went 30 to 40 feet underground, reinforced with heavy timber or steel rails, large enough to shelter entire companies of men. They built 2 complete trench systems a kilometer apart, with a third partially completed behind them, and placed carefully prepared machine gun positions on the high ground, because they held all the high ground with a nice clean view of the British positions and open ground in between. And in front of their trenches they had massive belts of barbed wire, in places 16 rows deep. But the British put their faith in the assumption that the bombardment would destroy all of this. The wire would be cut, the dugouts would be collapsed, the defenders would be dead or too shattered to resist, and the infantry would walk forward and occupy what was left. And voila, they won the war. Despite well-prepared defenses, 7 days of near-constant shelling still meant 7 days of absolute hell for the German soldiers sitting underneath it. Dugouts crumbled and buried men alive. Some were dug out suffocated, others smashed beyond recognition. Soldiers trapped underground became hysterical, desperately trying to run out into the open. Even the rats went hysterical, flooding into the shelters seeking escape from the bombardment above. They couldn't get out for food and water for the entire 7 days of non-stop shelling. The only problem was that the patrols sent out during the bombardment week to check whether it was actually working came back with deeply alarming reports. Opposite several divisions in the northern sector, they found the wire intact, and in some places thrown into even worse tangles by the shelling, while German defenders stood alert and ready. Disturbingly, many positions were still standing as if nothing had happened. Plus, the Germans now knew exactly where the attack would come from, and they knew that it would be a major one because of the sheer scale of the artillery preparation. They had an entire week to prepare reserves and plan what to do when the ground attack finally began. The attack would go ahead as planned. In the early hours of July 1st, approximately 120,000 British soldiers moved into position along an 18-mile front. They filed through communication trenches in the dark, packed shoulder to shoulder into the forward bays. Officers moved along the lines with ladles of rum, with double rations that morning just to relax the soldiers a bit, before the biggest catastrophe in the British army. They were told that the bombardment and mines would annihilate German defenders, and that their only job was to get up, walk over and capture the ground, perhaps take some stunned survivors prisoner. And when we say walk over, that is exactly what they were told to do. Rawlinson wanted the advance to be conducted at a walking pace, in long, straight lines, 5 yards between each man, advancing steadily and in formation across no man's land. He wanted soldiers not to run and rush because they were inexperienced like you heard earlier, and he worried that charging would break the order and make it impossible to command the men when the chaos began. On top of that, soldiers were carrying about 66 pounds of equipment on their backs, so running over the blasted terrain wasn't an option anyway. But as the bombardment had supposedly done the whole job, there was no need to hurry. At 7:20 a.m., the week-long artillery bombardment was due to finally lift and be redirected to the second German line. And then, at 7:28 a.m., 2 minutes before 0 hour, the British played their ace: mines. Now, when talking about the horrors of the Somme, we absolutely have to mention the underground mines. In the British sector, on the morning of July 1st, there were 19 prepared mines, 8 of them large and 11 smaller ones. If you're not familiar with the mines of World War I and the whole tunnel warfare, you can later watch our video on that as well. But in short, as it's not the topic of this video, mines were one of the creative attempts to break the trench stalemate. They basically dug tunnels underneath no man's land for months, and then packed tons of explosives beneath the German positions and prepared to simultaneously detonate them, after which the infantry would advance over devastated defenses and capture stunned survivors. That was, of course, if everything worked out according to plan, which in war is almost never. Just the construction of these mines is horrific enough, because tunneling companies were digging narrow tunnels under unstable ground and packing them with explosives, while trying not to be located by the enemy counter-tunneling party that would dig under them and place explosives to collapse their tunnels. It was one of the most terrifying and dangerous jobs in the entire war. Anyway, for the Somme specifically, the British had prepared over 110,000 pounds of aminal explosive beneath German positions. At 7:28 a.m. on July 1st, 2 minutes before 0 hour, the mines were detonated. They obliterated whole sections of the German front, threw earth high into the air and left giant craters that stand to this day in some places. German soldiers above the mines were buried or crushed by the detonations, with trenches collapsing completely with earth coming together. However, not all mines were detonated simultaneously as planned, and some of them created additional problems for the British infantry now close by. They had to go over the shattered terrain and were hit by falling debris. And on top of that, the surviving German defenders knew that as soon as the artillery had lifted, the infantry attack was already on the way, and they knew what to do. At 7:30 a.m., whistles blew along the entire 18-mile front, and over 100,000 men climbed out of their trenches and began to walk towards the German line. The Germans came up from their dugouts coughing out chalk dust and cordite, and they found something they could barely believe. Long, straight lines of British soldiers walking slowly towards them across open ground. In some sectors, no man's land was 500 yards wide, so they had more than enough time to set up machine guns and bring in the ammo. The wire we mentioned earlier that was supposed not to exist anymore was still standing with just the gaps in it where the heavy shells had hit it. So, soldiers who reached the German line found themselves funneled into the few gaps in the wire, and the Germans had placed their machine guns pointing directly at those gaps. And I think you can already guess what happened next. The bloodiest single day in British military history. By the end of the day, almost 20,000 British soldiers were dead, with 37,000 more wounded. This works out to roughly one man dying every 4 seconds for the entire day, and most of them happened in just the first 30 minutes. What happened in those first 30 minutes is almost impossible to put into words, but let's try. German machine gun crews opened fire and simply didn't stop, with some crews firing over 20,000 rounds that morning alone into the tightly packed funneled formations of British soldiers in the open. Germans looking out across no man's land later said they felt sick watching it. The wounded were perhaps the worst part, because the system to recover them simply didn't exist at that scale. There were 4 stretcher bearers per company, so wounded lay in no man's land for hours or days, some crawling backwards on their hands for 2 days before anyone picked them up because medical stations were overwhelmed. In one captured German trench, a long line of wounded British soldiers were found sitting where a medical station had been. The doctor and his orderlies had been killed by a shell, and the wounded men could only sit there and wait to die. Advancing troops were forbidden from stopping for wounded comrades. There was no time, and frankly, there was nowhere to take them anyway. So then there were the PALS battalions I've told you about earlier, and this is what I've meant by wait till you see how this serving together would backfire. Well, they died together too, whole battalions of men from the same streets and the same towns gone before breakfast. When the casualty lists reached England, in some towns there wasn't a street that didn't have its blinds drawn. The church bell tolled all day. 37 sets of British brothers died on July 1st alone. After the Somme, the remaining PALS battalions were broken up and reinforced with conscripts from across the country, ending their local character forever. And roughly 40% of British casualties at the Somme were diagnosed with shell shock, which in 1916 wasn't treated with much sympathy. And this was just July 1st. The battle would continue for another 4.5 months. Worth knowing that German losses for the day were somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000 men. The French 6th Army, fighting alongside the British in the south, suffered around 1,500 casualties. The southern sector is the only one where everything worked like clockwork. The French had over 900 heavy guns, concentrated on a much narrower front, used a creeping barrage, kept no man's land as narrow as 100 yards in places, and launched their bombardment only hours before the attack to preserve surprise. However, this success was never exploited because the British line to the north had collapsed. But Haig continued. For 4.5 more months, the battle ground on in a succession of grinding, bloody attacks that gained almost nothing. During this period, the British deployed the Mark I tank in battle for the very first time in history. So here's the final bill. British casualties, approximately 420,000. French, approximately 200,000. German, somewhere between 450 and 680,000, depending on who did the counting. Over 1 million casualties in 141 days, and all that for maximum territorial gain of roughly 7 miles. Bapaume, the town that was supposed to fall on day 1, wasn't taken until March 1917, and only then because the Germans voluntarily pulled back to a shorter defensive line. 72,337 men who died on the Somme have no known grave. Their bodies were so utterly destroyed by shell fire or swallowed by mud that they simply were never found. Their names are carved on the Thiepval Memorial, which stands 150 feet high in northern France. The 1916 Somme film was the first feature-length war documentary ever made. It was released in British cinemas in August 1916 while the battle was still raging, and it was seen by 20 million people in its first 6 weeks, nearly half the entire British population. And one interesting detail to end with, a 27-year-old Bavarian corporal that you might remember better by his name, Adolf Hitler, was wounded at the Somme in October 1916, hit in the thigh by shrapnel near Bapaume. He later described it as more like hell than war.